Hello friends, welcome to CC Gurukul live lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to continue further in our series on 20th century world literature. Dear friends, our topic of discussion is Russian fiction, and for the discussion we have with us in our studios Professor Anand Prakash. Professor Anand Prakash is a retired professor of English from Delhi University, a prolific and a dynamic professor. Through him we always get in-depth knowledge on various topics. As I always say that he enlighten us and show us the better path towards the life through his teachings. Friends, we know that you might have lots of questions while listening to us, and if you have any question, don't keep with you. Share this question with us. You can contact us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1-800-110-430. Now, I would like to welcome our guest, Professor Anand Prakash, once again, and would request him to give us more and more of knowledge on the topic that is Russian fiction. Hello, sir. Welcome to the lecture.
Thank you, Vidika, for your very encouraging words, and welcome viewers. This is one of the last lectures that we have in the series, as has been announced by our anchor. And Russian fiction, the people who are connected with literature in general have a very high opinion of Russian fiction. Russian fiction has a very high ranking in the criticism that is about literature in general and fiction in particular. But this is a topic that is generally overlooked by critics because of various reasons. I'll suggest some presence of prejudices in the course of my lecture. But to say something about Russian fiction is in fact an integral part of our knowledge today. That is what we should do, that is what we should keep in mind. And today's lecture would focus upon two important 20th century writers, Pasternak and Zhivago. And these writers went into slightly different directions, but they finally converged into a kind of significant statement that humanity of today requires. I'll come to that as I proceed. But before we start discussing these two authors, Pasternak and Zhivago, both of them were Nobel Prize winners in their time and in the 20th century. But before that we do that, we touch upon their fiction. Let me tell you the idea behind this fiction that existed much before it came into being. For instance, the first point that I can discuss with you would be about the nature and character of Russian fiction from the 19th century onwards. Nature and character is a broad aspect of writing, and in the case of Russian fiction, let's remind ourselves that the 19th century is the hallmark of Russian writing, and it is strange, it is slightly peculiar that in the 19th century, when we, for instance, were grappling with other issues of a more mundane nature, Russian fiction produced giants, people who have not been yet outdone in the 20th century, and I'm not sure, I'm not certain about the future response to their writing or the writing of others who follow them. Russian fiction at that point of time included giants like Turgenev, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Chekhov, and many others. And these are the names that all of us have to keep in mind in order to understand not just our reality, but the heights of aesthetic achievement that these writers touched. What is the nature and character of Russian fiction? It is very deeply society-centered. It talks about society. It talks about various relationships that exist in society. It talks about conflicts that exist between different classes. And it also focuses upon the objective elements of Russian life. Something that they may not be liking, or maybe they were very proud of them. In either case, they would have been swayed by the criticism or the approbation that they gave to Russian fiction. But Russian writers, when they talked about their society, in the 19th century, then they kept in mind only the objective reality. They didn't talk about their own personal passions. They did not talk about their own personal likings. They would not tell us about what they support and what they oppose. They just showed a kind of a mirror to the reality of their time. And this mirror was focused in their hands, upon things, that were central to the Russian existence at that time. It is this that made them great. Therefore, I use these two words, realism and realists. They were realists. They were committed to the reality around them. They would not bother to allow their prejudices to come in between themselves and their surroundings. And that's why they were great realists. And if danger came their way, if people tried to criticize them or discourage them, if people tried to attack them, if people tried to consciously deprive them of life's comforts and luxuries, they would not bother, because their main commitment was to the reality of their time. Therefore, and still more important, they were aesthetically very effective in their representation. That is very difficult to achieve. You have to go into the areas of reason, you have to go into the areas of emotions that you have inside you, that I have. For instance, if I am a realist, then I would like to examine also my own feelings and their nature. And then I would relate that feeling with the things around them, which is something very difficult. Many of us are not critical of ourselves. We can't, hold an opinion and still say that our opinion could be wrong, could go in the wrong direction, or that there are certain points of hatred in our temperament, which sometimes get crystallized in our responses. We let them pass by. We let them say, okay, they exist. We also sometimes say that they are real, which means that people can, while talking about their emotions, be subjective about those emotions. They can say they are right, they are real. If they say that, if they do not criticize themselves, then in my opinion and in the opinion of general criticism, they are not realists. So a realist is one who looks around, who recognizes what exists in front of oneself, and then one subjects it to a critical examination. And if you look at things, you see them, and yet want to relate them to something else, and then come to a conclusion which is open-ended, then only I become a realist. So it is this kind of realism that was there, at the background of the two writers that we will discuss. These realists of the 19th century that I talk about, these realists, set the bar very high. They would say this is what writing is. And the later people in the 20th century who would emerge on the literary scene, they would then, look at the giants behind them, and they would like to equal them. If not equal them, they would at least like to follow them, so that it led them somewhere. This is what realists means. The second word that I pick up for presentation today is realism. So realism is a kind of a doctrine, and it's not a doctrine in the sense that reality always changes. Realism also changes with time. Therefore, if you take it as a doctrine, as something in which you believe and which you give the understanding of law or principle, then it's not realism. Realism is that which is curious to know, which is eager to entertain a difference in one's perception, and that realism is outside the pale of, outside the control of the writer, of the realist. So realism evolves in somebody's writing in spite of that person. And sometimes, I can say that I am a realistic writer and I follow realism, and this is what realism is, and therefore I can, be realistic in my writing. Then I am deceiving myself. Then the writer is deceiving oneself, because realism is not the handmaid of the person who tries to become a realist or tries to follow realism. Realism is something that will be judged later on by your output, by my output. If one writes a novel, then that novel is a realism or not, is able to achieve that aspect of realism or not, then that will be decided by the time later and by the critics later. Therefore, these writers, in fact, they become bigger in the 20th century when they were not there, because then, you know, critics realized that it is they, you know, who showed them the true picture of the 19th century Russian life. So both, you know, realists and realism, there were the realist writers, and there was realism in their action, in their exercise. So I had to explain these two words in some detail, because these, you know, stand at the background, and they always make future writers conscious of their duty, their obligation, their task, the fulfilling nature, the likely fulfilling nature of their writing. And let me repeat, these people are like Turgenev, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Chekhov. If you read them today, sometimes you feel, when I read them today, sometimes I feel that they are talking about today, even though they wrote more than 100 years ago. And Tolstoy's War and Peace, in fact, is much more relevant today than it would have been in the latter half of the 19th century or the earlier half of the 20th century, when people were quite close to them. So this is the first point I make, and then, you know, I go to the last of the realists in that sense, in that classical sense in which realism emerged. You know, Russia at that point of time was governed was ruled by Tsar, a kind of a king, you know, who would determine the policies of the state, and you know, who would have all the time interests in mind, perhaps unconsciously, if not consciously, of the landed gentry in Russia. Russia's landed gentry, Russia's aristocracy, Russia's, you know, feudal lords and the members of feudalism, all of them were represented by, and their policies also were governed by, dictated by the Tsar. The Tsar was actually a political figure, a social figure, a figure of governance in the Russian state, and it is around him that all things that happened of consequence, of importance, were revolving. So if you took a stance against the Tsar or critical of it, critical of him, then, you know, you were in for trouble. But realists would not bother. They would show even the Tsar, and if not the Tsar, the individual, but Tsarism, then, you know, they would see that they had done something of value. The last realist, in my opinion, was Maxim Gorky. Maxim Gorky wrote in the 20th century, early 20th century. He was there till the 1930s. He was also closely associated with the great socialist leader Lenin. They had, you know, a regular interaction with each other, and Maxim Gorky would sometimes show his fiction to Lenin before he published it. It is said, you know, that the great novel Mother, written by Gorky, was read by Lenin before the novel was published, and that Lenin gave a feedback, very genuine feedback. He would not praise him sky high, as is the tradition, as the convention of, you know, of political leaders. He would say that Gorky was right, but he was not as great as his predecessors, and Gorky accepted this criticism with you know, humility, and would have made definitely certain changes in light of what Lenin told him. He was the last great realist, and in fact he was some kind of a link between Tolstoy and Dostoevsky on one side and the later writers in the 20th century. He was a link because he had ideologically, theoretically moved ahead of people like Tolstoy. I say ideologically, not aesthetically. Tolstoy was a great master of realism. It was very difficult even to come equal to him, what to transcend him. But then, you know, there is something called ideology in a writer, a thought system in a writer, and that thought system determines, regulates, sometimes limits the potential of the writer. And it was pointed out by no other person than Lenin, you know, that Tolstoy, in spite of all the greatness that he had, and very few people could outclass him at the world level, Tolstoy was somewhat limited by his vision of peasantry. Even though he was himself a count, he was himself of the upper classes, in his mind, in his sensibility, he identified himself with the cause of the peasant, and the peasant's idea of dreaming, the peasant's idea of loving one's soil, the peasant's idea of being very hardy, peasant's idea of being in love with nature. All these things are common between the peasant and Tolstoy. So Lenin pointed this out, and Maxim Gorky thought in the early 20th century when he was writing that peasant generally blocked the outlook of the writer, because the peasant would not take part in what is called political dynamics, cultural dynamics. Peasant would be stuck to the tradition. Peasant would always, take his attention away from, the relations that exist around him, because his final relationship is with nature. And Maxim Gorky wanted to go ahead from there, and he was active in politics. Gorky himself was organizing writers, he was organizing discussions with them, and even after the revolution, October Revolution in 1917, Maxim Gorky was active, and he had a kind of understanding about literary theory, and people can easily say today that he was a socialist realist, which is a new thing. People are realists. I already talked about realism, but then there is something called socialist realism, and socialist realism is that realism which takes you forward, which does not confine you to the present and the past, which other great realists did. Great realists also had the imaginative capacity to give an idea, but a vague idea of the future. So far as Gorky was concerned, he would also sometimes think about the future, which is very difficult to imagine at the present time, any time. But Gorky would say that there are certain ideas in the past and in the present which will take you forward, and you may err, you may make a mistake regarding their actual crystallization in future, but then generally those ideas have to be accepted and taken forward. So this is what socialist realism is. For instance, the future of humankind, according to socialist realism, according to Maxim Gorky, according to Lenin, according to other socialist thinkers, was the activity, the life and the principles of the worker, the industrial worker. Industrial worker did not belong to the past. Industrial worker also didn't belong to the present as much, because in the present he was bound by certain principles which came from the past. Industrial worker would always look ahead, would always talk about progress, would always talk about modernity, would always talk about a kind of unity between one person and another. A peasant may not do that. A peasant may love one's own soil, so to say. The peasant may love the village to which one belongs. The peasant also likes the forest, the streams, the sky, nature, some kind of a god, if not god in the manifestation of a human figure, at least in the manifestation of power. All these things are there, but the peasant cannot generally talk about relations with other villages, with other towns, with the world as a whole, and therefore the peasant is stuck to the present and the past. Now, socialist realism is shows the way forward. The way forward is to move to a good relationship with not just one's neighbors, but even to others whom one cannot see. So, the socialist realist would, in today's situation, would be aligning oneself with European countries, with American people, with the people of other so-called faiths, because after all, humanity is one. So, this idea of socialist realism was to some extent practiced by Maxim Gorky also. So, this is the brief introduction that I tell you about Russian fiction, because this thing is carried forward by the writers of the 20th century who can be classed under world literature. I say, for instance, that the process of social change from 1905 onwards and the climax in October Revolution, this was reflected by people like Maxim Gorky, and this also became a point of not just criticism and contention, but also inspiration by the two writers that we will be talking about. I take up, for instance, the 1905 revolution in Russia. What was it? It was a very bloody revolution. It was a revolution which involved a great deal of violence, and it failed. And Tsarism, came heavy on the 1905 activists of the revolution. Peasants were crushed, villages were devastated, the organizers of the movement in 1905, they were put behind the bars, they were done to death, and they were forced to sometimes run away from Russia. And it ended in a kind of bloodshed that is unimaginable elsewhere in the 20th century. But when it failed, when so much of blood had been shed, when the trade union and the other organizations had been banned, when people could not even breathe properly, in the sense that there was a kind of control over their voice, over their ideas. So it was that kind of a thing. But the failed revolution left its scars in a negative manner and in a positive manner. In the positive manner, in the sense that it made people think more and more about the chances of success sometime in future. So it laid the foundation of what came to be called later as the October Revolution that happened in 1917. And this period is of great upheavals, this period of great thinking, this period is of deep examination of one's ideas. And these are 12 years starting from 1905 and going up to October Revolution 1917. And these 12 years are of utmost importance for the Russian social development and evolution. And you can see that people were active in the small towns, in the villages, and some people would be taking into confidence the feelings and emotions of those who are part of the state. And writers would not write in their own name, they might write under assumed names. There were political leaders who could not operate from inside the country, so they would leave the country and be in touch with the ones who were in sympathy with them back home in Russia. So these 12 years have been judged as years of preparation, years of sharp struggle by the writers of the day. And one particular writer that I'll be discussing, Boris Pasternak, writes about this period with great empathy, with great sense of pain and frustration. And I'll tell you, his sympathies and his sense of support. That was not for revolution, but he was keeping his eyes open. And this keeping of the eyes open, this enabled him to understand the nature of pain. So in a way, I'm starting this way, that the 20th century unfolds itself, so far as Russia is concerned, in the form of these struggling 12 years, starting from 1905 and going up to 1917. And I use the word climax here, climax in October Revolution, because this time it succeeded. What mistakes had been done earlier, those mistakes would now no more be repeated. Let me tell you in passing, viewers, that these 12 years were also the years of what came to be called later as Soviets. What are Soviets? Soviets are kind of panchayats in Russia at that point of time. So activists, political dreamers, people who had a great intellectual power, the intellectual thought at their command, these people, some of them or their followers, they shifted to the villages, because villages were not as directly controlled by Tsar and his political machine, his state machine. So these people shifted to the villages, and there they were started working among the peasants. So that way Soviets became a kind of network that would later on influence the opinion of the Russian people as a whole. So just see that there is a kind of a link of Tolstoy in the previous century and the previous years with the peasantry, and that link is at the emotional level. These 12 years gave political activists and cultural activists a chance to go back to the villages, interpret the pains and sufferings of the villagers at that point of time, and equip them with ideas, equip them with political principles. And you can't overlook this fact in Russian case, that when one was active in the villages and one was feeling one with them, one was empathetic with them, felt the same way as the villagers felt, then the sensibility of the village also became progressive, in the sense that villagers would now think about other villages and they would think about the cities and small towns. Now just see that if villagers think like this, then the writers who write about them would be specially qualified to articulate their sense of pain, their sense of intellectual struggle. So these 12 years are important, not just ideologically and aesthetically, but also politically. So politics, aesthetics and ideology, these combine, they integrate, and they have a kind of evolution, a kind of frame, in which writing also learns a great deal and becomes still more deeply, passionately humanistic. Now, with this background, I shift to first this Boris Pasternak. His full name is Boris Leonidovitch Pasternak. He is a poet, he is a novelist and a literary translator. Now, these things, this is his equipment, this is his qualification, this is the kind of quality that he has. And he is a poet, which means he is sensitive. He knows how to use words at the level of not just ideas, but at the level of passion, at the level of feeling. And he's a novelist, and his famous novel is Dr. Zhivago, on which there was a film also later. And his language is not merely poetic, it's also lyrical. As if the person were singing silently through those words. So we have this poet, novelist and literary translator. Literary translator is another good quality in a writer, that you read other literatures. Other literatures means literatures written in other languages, and you then translate them into, for instance, in the case of Boris Pasternak, into Russian. How is translating literature beneficial for a writer? This is a question, viewers, that you should think, I should think myself, and my answer to this is that when one is translating a thing written by somebody else, then one is leaving one's own personal preferences and trying to understand the problems of the other writer whom one is translating. Now this widens the horizon of the writer translator, and this might have helped Boris Pasternak become much more deep in his understanding of human life and the interplay of emotions and feelings in one's mind. So he was three things: poet, novelist and literary translator. He was born in 1890. So when Russian Revolution, October Revolution took place, then he would be 27 years, which means that he saw the 20th century right from 1900, when he would be 10 years. When those 12 years I talk about, those crucial 12 years starting from 1905 to 1917 happened, then he was a teenager, and then he was becoming a young man. And the power of the teenager and of the young man is that these people understand things, try to understand things because they are happening in front of them in a manner that perhaps the old people or the two very, very young cannot do. So this person grew up in the atmosphere of those 12 years, and he saw people fighting, people disagreeing with one another, and many people oppressing others. So he had a mixed feeling about society around him. He would not be carried forward by the struggles that the people were at that point of time waging. He would look at them critically, and he would be looking at them at a personal level, from the personal angle, and that personal angle made him a poet, basically a poet. Of course he was a great novelist, but basically he was a poet because he would see individuals and he would look at the reality around him as an individual and from the eyes of other individuals whom he saw. Individuals would in any struggling time be suffering. The individuals have their own personal opinion, and sometimes that personal opinion starts controlling their overall situation at that point of time. So he lived till 1960, and he was between 70 years when he died, and in the meantime he had got Nobel Prize in Literature, and this Nobel Prize was for his book Dr. Zhivago. What is Dr. Zhivago as a novel? Dr. Zhivago talks about a young man who is a doctor, who is a physician, and who would be finally giving a chance to other characters to come in touch with him. When a patient goes to a physician, then the physician doesn't merely give medicines, does not give tests to the patient, does not examine him only at the level of the body, but also looks at the patient's behavior, talks to the patient, talks about his background, talks about his life, and then tries to understand the body of the patient with the mind of the patient. That's what a doctor does. So this doctor is very sensitive, and in a way one can say that Dr. Zhivago, the main character, the hero of this novel, actually is Pasternak himself, because Pasternak is writing keeping in mind the personality and the individuality of Dr. Zhivago, who is working there. Dr. Zhivago sees conflicts. Dr. Zhivago sometimes sees extremes of behavior of those who are political. When political people are fighting with others, and when they are riding roughshod, when they are supporting people who are in their life not very correct, then in Dr. Zhivago and Pasternak behind him, they feel bad. So he has a kind of apprehension about the negative role that politics may at that point of time perform. So Dr. Zhivago is a novel which talks more about the personal experiences of Dr. Zhivago, the hero, and these personal experiences also bring in, for instance, the theme of love, the theme of patience, the theme of suffering, and theme of loneliness, because individuals always feel lonely, and if the individual is particularly qualified, is particularly superior intellectually to others, then that individual remains cut off from the masses in general. So you will see that Pasternak as a writer and Dr. Zhivago as a character, they have a kind of prejudice against politics, and this is shown very clearly in Dr. Zhivago. So the scenes of love, the scenes of interaction with of a sensitive person with his beloved, these scenes are very powerful in this novel. They are absolutely mind-boggling in their sweep of emotion, and it is for this reason perhaps that the novel was awarded Nobel Prize in the 1960s, 1957 or so, when the novel was published. And there is a problem about this publication also. I will not go into that because I am constrained by time today, but let me tell you that this writer Pasternak was not liked by Russian critics and the Russian regime, and on his side he also did not like the Russian regime and the Russian critics. So he was a kind of a loner. He would sit in a corner and write, and sometimes he would publish, sometimes he would not publish. Dr. Zhivago could not be published because the regime thought, the political regime, socialists thought that he was criticizing Russia, and anybody who was criticizing Russia at that time, because there was a kind of ban on literature of the kind that was critical, therefore this person would feel stifled, suffocated, and somebody came from outside. It was an Italian publisher or his agent. He came, he saw this book, and in the manuscript form, it was not being published in Russia. He took stealthily the book from Russia to Italy. There he got it translated, and suddenly one saw that Pasternak was a great world writer, because the entire West welcomed him with open arms for his intensity. So this novel became great outside Russia and not inside Russia. When the Nobel Prize was given, why was it given? Partly because it was a great novel, but partly also because through the awarding of the Nobel award to this writing, they were criticizing the Russian politics and the Russian way of governance, Russian way of using ideology for understanding the society of the time. So it became a kind of a weapon in the hands of the world capitalism, that they would support a writer who was critical of Russia and was from Russia itself. Now, I'll finish my comment about this novel and about this writer with this particular conundrum, this particular problem. And the problem was that when the Nobel Prize was given, the Russian state asked this person, don't accept it, because this is against our country, this is against our culture, and if you accept it, then you would have to leave. Of course, when the Nobel Prize was awarded, then Stalin had died in 1952. The award was given in 1957 or so, and then it was not as strict. The regime was not as strict as it was earlier, and he was given this option. Okay, you publish this novel, you go and get this award, from the place where it is given. You go there, but you will not be allowed to come back. And do you know what Boris Pasternak did? Just guess. He had the option of taking the award and leaving his country, and he had the option of refusing the award and living in his country. Like a great Russian, writer, he rejected the award, refused to take the award, and he stayed back in Russia. He was very unhappy. He felt very bad, that the regime was so very intolerant. But then he said, no, I can't leave Russia. I live here. I don't take the award. So he didn't take the award. He refused it and stayed back. But then he was definitely very melancholic. He was definitely very, very depressed and distressed. And in any case, he was a loner, as I said earlier. And when the whole world was singing paeans for him, praises of one praise after another, at that point of time, this person was quiet. And finally, in 1960, he breathed his last, and he died of cancer. So this is about this writer. I call him a writer of great humanism, of his own kind. This humanism is skeptical of the intolerance that sometimes ideology shows towards literature. And why not? If some writer is stifled like this, then I think socialism has to expand its scope to appreciate, to take into consideration the power of such writing. If you read Dr. Zhivago, you will find that the scenes of love, the scenes of empathy, the scenes of richness of feeling of a lover with his beloved, and the scenes of integration regarding the family, regarding the village, regarding the citizens at the individual level are concerned, they are absolutely beyond description. So I say a great writer, Dr. Zhivago, the writer of Dr. Zhivago, Pasternak. He was there till 1960 when he died, and he wrote many poems. He also wrote translations of others, and he was particularly attracted to Shakespeare's Hamlet. And these things, showed that the man was absolutely inspiring and appealing to the Russian people and the public of the people of the world as a whole. So I say, sympathetically talking about him, that even though he was critical of socialism at that point of time, there is no reason why such a writer should not be appreciated. He had something great to say, and because of this, he was able to create a sense of involvement in the world as a whole. And the world is not exactly the capitalist world in that sense, because the world is suffering also under the weight of capitalism. And the suffering of the capitalist societies, of the people in the capitalist societies, this suffering unites the suffering of people in Russia and the suffering of people elsewhere. And that's how I would interpret even the world literature, which is a tendency to unite the ordinary masses across the countries, across languages. So so far as this novel is, this writer is concerned, I just maybe take a quote, and then I'll go to the other writer. Let me read this quotation for you. This is a quotation from Boris Pasternak. Just see. I don't like people who have never fallen or stumbled. What does it mean? If people have failed, then he sees them better. Because if they never stumbled and if they never fell, then they can't show many quirks, many changes that occur in the sensibility of humanity. Then he says, their virtue is lifeless and it isn't of much value. If somebody has always succeeded, then this person doesn't have much value to give to me. Somebody should fail. In failing, one is aware of one's weaknesses. And human beings have this capacity to fail, to suffer, and to see the weaknesses. And seeing of weaknesses, in fact, makes them stronger later. So they just see a very different kind of an understanding of life that all of us would like to succeed. But how many know how to fail? How many of us know how to fail and accept it? In fact, we are good winners. Human beings, most of us are very good winners, but very, very bad losers. When we lose, then we start feeling so bad about the whole world as if nothing good exists. But there are many things which are good, which exist in spite of our individual personal failure. So this is the kind of understanding that he has about life, and because he always he was always lonely, and he didn't have much communication with many others. Therefore, he would sit quietly and he would think about the helplessness, the problems that created by certain sections in society, and that the writer naturally would not be able to sympathize with those things. So I tell this date again. Dr. Zhivago, published in 1957. It's about life of Yuri Zhivago, a physician and poet. The time depicted in the novel between the Russian Revolution of 1905 and the World War II. That's the time of his writing. That's the time of his understanding. When the World War finishes sometime in 1945 or so, at that time the writer is 55 years old. He has been formed as a writer. He has been formed as a sensibility, and whatever he writes now onwards, from 30s onwards in fact, up to the end, would be a product of the personality that has been shaped during these years. The plot is long and intricate. This novel is very close to our kind of writing. The plot is long and intricate. What does it mean? Intricate means it doesn't follow any straight line. Things revolve. Sometimes things go inside themselves. There's a word that takes you into the mind of the character, rather than taking the character to meet other people elsewhere. So that kind of a writing is very intricate, and this is like modern existence. So he does that. Maybe this is one reason why critics of the world liked this novel and recommended it and enabled him to get the Nobel Prize for it. It is called unpredictable in its ways. When you read the novel, when I read the novel, of course, I was all the time at a loss as to what exactly this novel is leading me to. But then I knew that life is like that. I can't always predict exactly what's going to happen. So these are things that I wish I could talk more about this novel, but then I have to think of the other writer. There is a film by David Lean, the great filmmaker, in 1965. Because 57 took 8 years for the film to be conceived and finally made, and themes: loneliness, disillusionment with revolutionary ideology, coincidence and unpredictability of reality, which is always there, and there are many things that I would like to say, but I cannot because there are problems about time. So the next writer that I will be now discussing would be Sherlock Holmes, and let's see what exactly this person has to tell us regarding the life of his time. Sherlock Holmes is known for writing about life and fate of Don Cossacks during the Russian Revolution, the Civil War, and the period of collectivization. These are the difficult words. This writer doesn't talk about the individual. You would also have seen in contrast with, that's why perhaps I chose these two novelists. One talks about the individual internal life, the other talks about the social life and the outside world. And Sherlock Holmes is the writer of the outside world. So when you read Sherlock Holmes, you read about the Russian society. You read about the classes, the groups, the sections in the Russian society, and how they coexist, how they clash, and how they fight. So you would say that it's more sociological. It is more society oriented. It's not about the individual. It doesn't talk about the psychology of people. It talks about their social suffering. It talks about their politics directly. It talks about their debates. When people, 10 people get together and they start discussing something, then sometimes they disagree and they fight. That also is reality. Reality is not merely what I think inside myself. Reality is also that which I express through my words when I discuss things with somebody else. So it is that kind of a writer. How would you rate such a writer? There is a writer who is poetic. There is a writer who is that way prose oriented. He wants to talk. He wants to describe. He wants to take you into the lives of other people and how they suffer in that sense. if there is poverty, if there is hunger, if there is starvation, if there is suppression, if there is sacrifice to be made for others, then this is a different kind of writing. I think literature has both qualities, both aspects, both varieties inside it, and so far as Sholokov is concerned, he talks about this outside reality. And please do not forget, this person Sholokov is known as a socialist realist writer, writes about socialism, supports it. In fact, he is the member of the Communist Party of Russia. What does he write? Does he preach? Does he blindly follow any dictum from somewhere? Let's find out. His great novel, which is about Quiet Flows the Dawn, there is a river called Dawn, and he's writing about that river. I think that will make him a great writer, because the writer is not talking about Russian society as such. He is writing about the river that is there in Russia, and this is a great river. Like in today's India, if somebody writes about Ganga or Jamuna, it will be a different kind of a writing. And the people who live on the sides of the banks, people who live, away from them but still talk about them, then that will be a way of finding out the life of the people there. So he talks about Cossacks, which is a community of the eastern part of the western part of the western part of Russia and the eastern part of Europe, and this community is very freedom loving. And when Russian Revolution occurs and when civil war occurs in Russia, then these people don't support Russia. And this writer, he is from that particular community, Cossacks, and he writes about them, and they are fighting the Russian revolutionaries, and he is depicting that. How do you interpret this? That the writer belongs to that part which believes in freedom, and this part fights with the Russian revolutionaries, and this man is showing that fight very clearly, which means that he is not following any principles from anywhere else. He saw it and he depicted it, and yet he was a member of the revolutionary party, the Communist Party, and he was recognized by people. So this gives a totally different picture of Russia and Russian writing. Russian writing internally can be a writing of courage, and therefore I would say that this writing of Sholokov, and I just talk about one novel, Quiet Flows the Dawn, Dawn is the river, and that this person then after Boris Pasternak, because he was a great writer of Russia, and he was a historian, he was a kind of sociologist, he was a kind of cultural historian, and he was very powerfully depicting the situation in Russia. So friends, I could not do proper justice to the second writer because because of the greatness of the two writers. So I would say that there are two streams in Russian writing in the 20th century. One stream is the individualistic poetic stream that is represented by Boris Pasternak, and the other is the social stream, the political stream, the stream of struggle, the stream of ideas, the stream of description, the stream of telling people how they live along the rivers and how they become hardy, how they become hardworking, how they become tough and solid in their approach, and how they fight. That also is very important. So let's see that Russian writing of the 20th century is a writing of courage, is a writing of development, is a writing of dynamism, is a writing of freedom, social freedom. And on the other side, Russian writing also is a writing of feelings, of a writing of lyricism, of a writing of that kind of liquid quality about humanity which connects people of all directions, coming from different places. So I would say that these two examples in particular, and Russian writing in general, this is truly a integral part of world literature, because this writing promotes love and affection as well as solidarity between people of all countries and all cultures. So finally I would say that these two writers will tell us about our own life in our own respective countries through the depiction of intense kinds that they did in their writing in the Russian language. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so much for giving us this session. Friends, you would write to us at info.cc@nic.in if you have any question in mind. We are going to meet again soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye.